Hello, hi, my name is Lauren Driskell, and today I will be conducting a Head to Speech podcast. The episode title for today is How Does the Lab School Advocate for Students with Learning Differences? So, like I said, my name is Lauren Driskell. I am currently a senior health management major at Howard University. I'm an aspiring speech pathologist. So in about September, I started my internship with Head to Speech because I wanted to gain more knowledge on the field of speech pathology. And I've known for some years that this is something that I wanted to do. And so I'm also an ambassador for Head to Speech. So I shortly became an ambassador after I had started my internship because I wanted to gain more experience besides the research work that I was doing at Head to Speech on the field of speech pathology. And I wanted to continue to broaden my knowledge on the gap between brain health and athletes. Today I'm going to be interviewing Jacob, who is a speech pathologist and a coach at the Lab School of Washington.
Hi, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the chance to answer some questions you have. A bit about myself is that I say recently, like a year ago, received my degree from George Washington University in speech language pathology. I did undergrad at Vanderbilt University with a degree, a Bachelor of Science in Child Development. And I'm a speech therapist because I'm really nosy. I was previously a preschool teacher while in college and during a year after I graduated, and I really enjoy working with children. And I also like to know what's going on in terms of communication. Like, why is a child talking this way? We used to have speech therapists who would come into my classroom and do sessions with kids, and they would give me tips and tricks about, how to foster good communication in children, how to help that development. And I realized that I wanted to still work with children, but also be more hands-on in the research, which is where I started looking into speech pathology. And it's been a great time. I enjoy my job a lot. I enjoy a lot of the research I get to look into. I was able to participate in some research while getting my master's. And now I work primarily with high school age children. Um, and at the lab school, all of our students have a language-based learning difference. That's the terminology we use here. So a lot of my students have dyslexia or dysgraphia or dyscalculia. Some of my students have expressive language disorders. Um, and it is very, I think, enjoyable for me as a researcher, as a clinician, to try to tackle these cases. A lot of my kids have complex cases and backgrounds. So I enjoy being able to try various approaches and things. While working here, I've also been coaching boys basketball. I'm the head coach of the JV team. I'm assistant coach on the varsity team. I grew up playing sports, playing basketball my whole life. I did some assistant coaching in college. That was very enjoyable. And it's also fun to work at different levels. So Lab is not a basketball school, but we have a basketball team. So it's nice to work with these kids and help them work on why they love the sport, and their communication. Other sports related things I've done. I did track growing up, which involved a lot of talking if you're running relays. And I've also been doing boxing, which you have to talk a lot about so that you don't get knocked out and get embarrassed in front of all of your gym mates. So I am glad to have this opportunity to talk about the overlap between my job and sports.
Yes, thank you so much, Jacob, for joining me today. And I really appreciate, you sharing your background, why you love being a speech pathologist, when you decided you wanted to become a speech pathologist, and how your job, you're not only a speech pathologist, but you do also work with student athletes. And we do know that there is a gap between athletes, their brain health, and speech pathology. So I just had some questions for you for this podcast. So you had mentioned some of the disabilities that students at the lab school may have, and I wanted to know, how do these disorders impact them in sports?
So that's a really good question that I had to think about a lot before I started coaching. Several of the other coaches here have worked at lab or with this population for a year, so they had some tips for me. And there were things that I had thought about, but it is nice to have them kind of reaffirmed from people who've been doing the thing you want to do. So several of my players are on my caseload. Okay, so we already have like a pretty good rapport built up, so I understand to a degree, case to case, how my kids need to communicate. Things I have to take in consideration is what I send my players home with, right? And also how I communicate with my players at practice. A lot of coaches will give their players playbooks and materials to go over. And with my kids who struggle with things like reading and comprehension of dense materials, I try not to give them anything that involves long sentences that they have to read over. I try to provide them with video information. The kids benefit from a lot of footage. Um, the kids also benefit from a lot of just visuals and pictures. So we have diagrams of plays that we go through. Or if I call a timeout, I have to make sure I repeat myself a lot. The kids, they benefit from a lot of repetition. A thing to keep in mind with this population is that often there's comorbidity between whatever the language-based diagnosis is and something like ADHD. So that's a struggle for my children in terms of I know I need to pay attention to coach. He's giving me feedback, but it also is hard for me to stay focused on this right now because there's so many things going on in the gym. So a lot of my practices and coaching involves things like repetition, just so that the kids can hear something 1,000 times and then it'll stick at least once, and that's good. A lot of alliteration because that's easier to pick up when you hear something. So like something, a motto I use when I coach and I try to have our team philosophy is the PPP plan. Shout out to the government, I guess. I tell my kids we need to play with passion, we need to play with purpose, we need to play with pace. And every day before practice, I ask the kids, what's our plan? And they know. And before games, I check in with the kids on the way, what's our plan? And they know. And it helps to shape how they work, how they, do things. And they appreciate that support because it's easier for them to remember. And I appreciate that support because it makes my coaching a lot easier. So I'm not talking myself blue in the face, trying to convince them that they need to make certain cuts or set certain screens. In terms of like pure basketball things, a lot of these kids didn't grow up playing basketball. So we do a lot of repetition of basic basketball skills, shooting a layup, boxing out, putting both hands up to catch a rebound. And then when it comes to like plays, we don't run, thousands of plays because my kids, I think we get kind of overwhelmed with all the information to process. So we drill like 3 plays, and really one of them is just like basic basketball. It's not really a play. Um, and I think that takes the cognitive load off for the kids so that it's easier for them to remember, okay, I have all these things going on. And I also know if I get stressed out in the game, I fall back on this one thing that coach always has me do. This is what I do. I have my kids practice like normal basketball teams that kind of practice. Everybody knows their role. So my kids know, oh, if I'm not playing, I'm watching this player and I'm listening to the things that coach says to this player so that it's my information. So it really just helps me not have to manage as much because with my assistant coach, who's also spent a long time working at the lab school, we understand like the kids can only manage so much information at a time. So we try to make it as relevant and as succinct as possible, to not throw them off.
Thank you. What are some of the most common speech and language difficulties you see in students with learning disabilities?
So a lot of my kids, like I mentioned earlier, have comprehension or expressive issues that pop up. So I have to give them a lot of processing time, right? So in sports, you need a lot of split decision making. And so I'm asking my kids to make the split decisions, and it can be tough for them. So a lot of times I use all my timeouts in the game. I burn through my timeouts because I know my kids need a second um, to sit and think with things. I do a lot of substitutions so that if a player does something wrong and I make a comment about it from the sideline, I give them time to come off, sit, talk to me about what happened, come up with a plan about, okay, this is what I'm going to do when I go back in the game. At free throws, I'm having to call kids over because I know that the ref blowing the whistle, giving them ref tips, they always love to say, like, oh, 33, watch out for your hand. So I have to pull them to the side and be like, okay, what did the ref say? What do you think that means? Is that correct? Is it incorrect? If it's incorrect, I have to tell them what it actually means and how to go about holding it in their mind and bringing it to the game. So a lot of repetition of things and giving them plenty of processing time. And then also on the expressive side, some of my kids, when they get worked up or if there's a lot of information going on quickly, they have a hard time explaining to me, well, coach, this is what I'm seeing on the court, or coach, I need this guy to do this. And so I really have to be vigilant in watching the full game so I can say, hey, 25, this is what two is saying to you. This is what he means by this. This is what you need to do when you get back in the game. Um, and that can help. Sometimes it'll slow the game down, I think, for the kids because they're trying to communicate so much. And so I encourage them to lean on the things we drill so that they don't have to do as much live thinking, as much live, piecing together utterances in the game because I know it can be tricky. It can be hard for typically communicating players in the same positions. So I try to reduce the load that my kids have to do language wise. I tell them, we play with our hands up, and this is basketball's one of the few times we're allowed to point. In most instances, it's rude to point at someone. When we're playing basketball, I tell the kids, I'm like, you can yell out your teammate's number and point it at the opposing player, and your teammate knows, okay, this is my man, or this is my area. This is what I'm responsible for. So things like that really cut down on the disconnect between what my players want to say and what they have time to formulate in the game because we don't get that much time on. I might get a minute talking to my kids for my timeouts of 30 seconds. So it helps to try to reduce the load of communication and like give them easier ways to communicate with each other.
Thank you. That must be really helpful for your students. I know basketball can be very stressful and there's a lot of things going on. And so my next question was regarding how they're able to excel in the field or court. So how do student athletes with learning disabilities excel in the field or court?
So some of my kids, since they have ADHD, they struggle a bit with focusing on what I need them to focus on at the time because there's so much stimuli often at a sporting event. Some of my kids are locked in though. They will find the one thing that is really pertinent to them at the time, and that's their job. I have a kid who is very concrete with his language. So if I say, hey, 30, I need you to get in the game and box out, he will get in the game and he will box out the entire game. Offense, defense, sometimes in transition, he's boxing out another player. And so sometimes that can be a bit of a detriment because he won't dribble the basketball at the court or he won't set a screen. But if I say, this is your job, I need you to do it, he'll do it. I have some kids who play other sports like soccer where you have to do a lot of running. And I'm like, okay, you're good at running. All I need you to do this game is run between this spot and this spot on the court. And I need you to focus only on this. And they will say, okay, that's my job from coach, and I'm going to do it. And they do it every play. Um, I also think that sometimes since my kids know each other so well, they know their teammates can only respond to certain criticism or feedback or instruction. That does help some of my players in terms of saying, hey, I need help on this side. The way they speak to each other is often a lot calmer than kids would be in a heated situation. Sometimes I think they're a bit kinder to their teammates because they understand and a mistake might be made because of a lack of or breakdown in communication, not because you're bad at basketball, which I think helps my kids' teammates, their camaraderie a lot. There's less pointing fingers and I think a bit more acceptance. So I think that is good. And I really appreciate that and being able to work with kids who are good teammates. They're just nicer to each other sometimes. And that's good because it saves a lot of management work on my part when I have to manage children having problems. They are managing each other for the most part. Um, they also typically aren't long-winded kids, which I like. When we have something to discuss about sports, the kids, if they can get the words out, get right to the point, they ask me straight up, Coach Wade, what are we going to do? And I say that. Um, and I think that helps keep things flowing well. Not too many traffic jams communication.
Thank you. My next question is, are there specific exercises or activities in basketball that you find helpful in encouraging better brain health?
Yeah, so a lot of speech therapy is about strengthening your compensatory strategies, right? And so like, okay, maybe you have a TBI and you have a hard time outright retrieving words. So you have to talk around that. So in basketball, a lot of times I have my kids set up on offense and defense, and we move the ball, and the defense is supposed to be in certain positions. So we'll pause, everyone freezes, and I have the kids say, what's wrong? Everybody look at the defense. I took a picture. Who's out of place? And they'll say, so-and-so's out of place. And I'm like, okay, well, how's that a problem? And then they say, well, it's a problem because if he's here, his man has this space. So now my kids are looking at a problem, identifying it, and then trying to come up with a sentence with enough detail explaining to me why it's a problem. So that is targeting their expressive language because then they can go back to school maybe and carry that with them. Okay, there's a problem with this assignment, and this is why it's going to be, this is why it's a problem. This is how it's going to impact the rest of the problem. Other activities I think help are I have them do like a target identification drill where we swing the ball, then someone's going to be the shooter. And I tell my kids, you have to know at all times who's the shooter, who's shooting the ball, where's your man. So I'll stop and I'll ask the kids not just where your man is, but I'll say, okay, where is so and so's man? So they'll say, okay, he's over there and the shooter's over there. So I'm like, okay, well, what should he do? He should box out this way to get a rebound. So it helps my kids not just think about themselves, but try to think about the whole context of the game, which is hard for some of my students in school to think of big picture issues. They're thinking all of a sudden of the whole court and where's a player on the court. So they can tell me where a guy is. They can tell me what he's doing wrong, what he's supposed to be doing, and how that's going to maybe impact them getting a rebound and moving in transition. Other things we do are just basic stuff where I pair the kids up. I'll pair a kid who's better at a skill with the kid who maybe needs more support. And I'll say, okay, your job is to go over here on this hoop and teach this kid this drill. And I tell the kid who maybe needs a little help, I'm like, your job is to tell him why this is difficult for you. Try your hardest. So I rotate between sections. And what I see is that my kids who are stronger in a skill have a lot more confidence in their expressive language and are able to try to demonstrate through modeling, right? Compensatory strategy. They know maybe he will understand this breakdown orally, but if I demonstrate it to him, he can see it. And then my kid who's maybe a little weaker will try to also explain, okay, this is where I'm struggling. So they're all communicating a lot more than maybe a typical um, basketball program would because I'm having them go back and forth and try to teach each other things.
All right. And then my next question was, what are the benefits of sports for student athletes with learning differences?
I think really just the communication and empathy piece. Typically, high school students are not very kind. No matter what population you work with, there can be a lot of, it's high school, it's a tough age for children. There's a lot of social development going on, and organically, children aren't always super duper kind to each other. So having teammates, and I try to, part of my team culture is I'm like, you guys are brothers here. So having teammates means you're responsible for the people around you, you're responsible for your teammates and yourself. And that forces them to be a bit kinder to each other. That forces them to be more considerate to how they speak to each other, which I think helps with their social emotional development. And then again, in terms of just pure language expression and reception, I ask my kids multiple times, does everybody understand? And if they don't understand, they know it's very allowed, acceptable, and encouraged to say, Coach, I don't get this. Can you explain it? Coach, I don't understand because so I push my kids to speak as much as possible in practice, which again can sometimes slow down practice, but I think it's good for them as communicators. And which is why, I kind of take that doc in time as a speech therapist because I know most of my children play basketball because it's fun. None of my kids have like hoop dreams or aspirations. So when we leave here, they're going to go back to being students and people, and it's more important, I think, to support them in their development as communicators than it is to practice them shooting three-pointers. Um, so it really does, they get a lot of practice talking. They get a lot of practice explaining things or trying to talk about issues they have. A lot of my kids have an IEP goal where it's so and so be able to explain the disconnect between academic vocabulary and their understanding in X amount of opportunities in 3 out of 4 trials. So then they're getting an opportunity to practice that skill. So some of my students, I see them either implement it well or kind of poorly. And then it's like reference data in my mind for when we go back to our sessions. And also I'm like, okay, well, here's how I'm going to push you to try this skill outside of school. So then when they go back to class with their other speech therapists, because most of our kids have a speech therapist on staff here. That's a good thing about lab. There are a lot of speech therapists. When they go back to their other speech therapists, they have practiced this skill or they can reference like, oh, in practice, coach made me do this. And that's kind of like this. And it's like, yes, that is like that, which can then roll over to the classroom. which I know that their professors appreciate and their parents appreciate, and I appreciate because and they're getting some practice.
Thank you. So, to my understanding, basketball can be very supportive for students on a multitude of levels, including improving how they feel about themselves in and out the court. How do sports help students gain self-esteem?
Sports put a lot of, I think, manageable pressure on children. And I say manageable because these kids are, for the most part, playing for fun. They're not playing for a living, which can be very stressful. And also, they're playing with people who they know well. A lot of our kids at LAP have been here for multiple years, like at typical schools. They know these children years and years and years. They know these people well. So, on the one hand, they know the things that the kids maybe are really sensitive about and easy to pick at. On the other hand, they know, like, oh, I need to talk to him a certain way. I need to give him a certain amount of respect, or he won't function well. So I think that my kids really benefit from having this community that transfers over into most of their life. A lot of my kids are multi-sport athletes, so a bunch of them played soccer together, and now they're playing basketball. A bunch of them played football together, now they're playing basketball. And like after this, oh, we're gonna go and run track, coach. Will you come and coach track with us? And they like that sense of community. They like having people who understand them and also are around them, just giving them the energy they need. They really benefit from that. I have some students whose parents make them play because they want them to have like a physical activity and they want them to also maybe develop some communication skill building. So those kids I watch out for more because I know that they're not doing something that they would choose to do. So I know that can require a little more support. Um, but I have a player who used to come to practice and would just be there. And he told me, he said, I'm here because I asked him, I said, do you like basketball? He says, no, I'm here because my mom makes me play basketball. I said, it's fine. So he would participate in drills, but he would kind of do his own thing. He didn't have a lot of buy-in. It's kind of like with therapy. If you don't have buy-in, it's not really going to benefit you or the people who are working on it. Um, so we are playing, and I'm not pushing him super duper hard because I know that he's doing it because he has to do it, not because he loves it. So I'm trying to leave him alone, for the most part, trying not to make it a more unpleasant time for him than it is. He would always ask, Coach, how long is practice? When is practice done? When are my parents going to come pick me up? And he's a high schooler, so he's giving a lot of sass with these questions. And then one day they had a like a competition in practice about free throw shooting, and his was the winning free throw. And this kid had never been excited about practice, never been excited about really anything aside from maybe World War II ship restoration videos. And he runs up to me, gives me a hug, picks me up in practice. So I'm like, "Whoa, that's crazy. Never done that before. Please put me down." Um, and following that, he was so much more engaged in practice and so much more social in school. So like I see them and I try to check on the kids at school and I say, oh, check on your brother, make sure he has his dress because I make them dress up for games and stuff. Make sure everybody knows what practice is. And I'll see them now eating with him at lunch, right? So this kid who wasn't as social before now has some sort of a friend group. He's eating with kids he used to not eat with, and now he's also talking to their friends outside of stuff about just basketball. And I see him come to practice now, and he's so much more engaged and happy. He's a lot more positive energy about basketball. He tries his hardest. And he's, previously wasn't a kid who really cared about basketball, but now he's like, Coach, what should I be doing? Coach, can I get in the game? And I'm like, yes, you can. And I try to also celebrate a lot of the wins that my kids have. Um, we're not a great basketball team, but when we do things right, I highlight it. So I'll be like, cheers to so and so for doing this. The kids clap it up. Cheers to so and so for doing that. And then when we come to school the next day and we talk about basketball with the varsity boys with the rest of the kids, my kids will say, well, oh, yes, we lost the game, but so and so did this the other day in the game and it was really cool. And I can see like the pride that my kids are starting to develop about the fact that they're on the basketball team and, you know, I boxed that guy out and got a really good rebound, or I dove for the ball and saved it, and everybody really appreciated my energy. So I see the kids kind of building each other up, and I see them being more social, in positive ways. And then I think that is extending to even the kids they don't play basketball with.
Thank you. So my next question was, what improvements in motor skills and coordination do you see in children that play sports at the Lab School of Washington?
I see a lot of kids stop having two left feet. A lot of our kids have OT to work on like life skills and things like that. And a lot of our kids also have PT because they had some other thing. Like I have a player who used to, he had he had a lot of surgeries growing up. He used to not be able to walk, and now he plays basketball. He loves basketball so very much. It's his favorite thing in the whole wide world. And so he comes on the court and he practices very meticulously how he should move his feet for X, Y, and Z thing. So he knows how to pivot perfectly. He knows how to swim around for a box out. He knows how to do basketball moves that involve specific footwork. And I see him practicing it, right? And the kids all know his story. They know how he grew up. And then I see my other kids practicing it. So now I have a bunch of kids essentially doing some light PT by working on specific movement patterns and specific skills and moving their bodies in ways they're not used to. My kid whose parents made him play basketball used to be really bad at dribbling with either hand. But he comes to practice and they all get to practice early so that they have some free time to work. And he will pick up a basketball and he will go find a spot on the court. And I see him working on keeping his hand on top of the ball and getting familiar holding the ball a certain way. I see him working on using his body to stay strong with the ball. A lot of the kids would, if pressure comes, they would fold over or they stand on one foot. And now I see my kids really being a bit stronger, being more confident. And some of that is because of the reps and like the practice and the muscle memory. Some of that is because they've actually, gotten physically stronger from the exercise. I come from a basketball program. We do a lot of running, so I make my kids do a lot of running. They run as a punishment. They run as a reward. I'll say that was really good. You guys owe me some laps. Um, and sometimes they hate it, and sometimes they just understand that's part of the game. You have to be in shape. Basketball is not a sedentary sport. Um, so I see them then, walk a little straighter. I see some muscle development. Some of my kids. Some of my kids I've seen, lose a little weight. Some of the kids I see just play a little better. I know when we first started the season, we played against the varsity guys, and it would be tough for them. It was a lot more scary because they can be more physical kids. That's why they're the varsity team. And now I see my kids catch up. I see my kids feel a lot more confident. I see them not get pushed around so much. And then I hear from because I try to check on them outside of school, I hear from the coaches who coach like PE or the conditioning classes. Oh, so and so ran the mile with a way better time today, or so and so did, X amount of box jumps today. He had a new height record. So I think just from having this intense athletic requirement, they are getting stronger everywhere else. And I appreciate it. Their parents appreciate it. I think the kids appreciate it as well. Um, and then also I know it helps, with some fine motor skills in terms of making certain passes or shooting a shot a certain way. A lot of the kids, when we first started, they had some not optimal muscle memory for how to shoot a basketball. We work on stuff like that. I make my kids practice having a certain form. So it's like they work on a lot of body control. And I also make them flip and do the opposite. So it's like, okay, this is how you shoot with your right hand. What are you supposed to do if you're shooting with your left hand? Which is expanding essentially their muscle memory and how comfortable they feel doing stuff with the basketball. They're not leaving here using a basketball to drive, but it is, I think, in expanding their motor skills for everything else they do in life. Some of my kids were pretty clumsy, and now they're not as clumsy because they actually have a lot of body awareness. They really lacked proprioception before. Now they are, because I'm like, you need to know where you are on the court. Are you out of bounds? We're gonna run for that. Or are you gonna draw a foul because you're in a bad position? We're gonna run for that. And so I think that has helped out some of my kids physically outside of playing the sport.
All right, thank you. Now I wanted to discuss the topic of brain injuries and athletic performance.
So that's something I think a lot about. I started boxing kind of seriously in grad school. My brother was a boxer when I was little, and my mother would not let me box because she said it's not good for your brain, causes some problems. And so I would sneak away to work out my brother and go watch his fights. And I thought it was so cool. And then I become a speech therapist, and I'm like, oof, boxing is kind of dangerous. I got to be careful about it. And so I'm thinking about things. I'm doing my A&D rotation, which is my acquired neurological disorders rotation. So a lot of my clients had TBIs or had strokes or something like that. And I'm really like heavily thinking about, okay, how to protect the brain and do these things that are essentially dangerous and really just negative for the brain. So when it comes to boxing, I wear my headgear, and the studies on that are debatable about how much that protects my actual brain. Um, but I wear my headgear. I practice good defense so that I don't have to rely on my headgear absorbing the force of blows. I put my little Vaseline on there so things slip a little bit. And then for my kids, I'm very, especially my varsity kids because they play harder, I'm very aware of falls in the game and checking on them to see like, okay, how's your communication? Am I noticing a problem? I had a kid in a tournament fall, hit his head twice. So I was like, okay, you should sit down and then we'll have the medic come check you out. He was fine, but that is something that I think I'm hyper vigilant of because I know how serious these things could be. A lot of concussions go unreported. Kids don't even realize, oh, I'm having an issue because I bumped my head really hard. They think I just need to take a minute. You see a lot of football players where they have like the concussion shakes. They try to shake it off, like, oh, I need to clear the cobwebs. Like you can't shake a concussion away. So I'm hyper vigilant about things like that. A couple of my kids here also box. They box at the gym that I train at. Um, so I talk to their coaches about, hey, and the coaches are pretty good about it because they're children, so they change the intensity up. And I'm like, hey, watch out for so and so for me, or I'll go and watch them spar, watch them practice. I'm like, okay, you need to work on this so you can keep that head safe because one, they're children, so they need to be taught how to ease into things, how to do, essentially a dangerous thing safely. And two, they're, my students here, so I know they have these profiles. I know what they already struggle with linguistically. So maybe nobody would even notice that this child had a concussion because he always talks a little funny in air quotes. Um, so I try to stay on top of things like that. And I also know that when we come doing speech therapy, some of my kids, we do like cognitive tasks in therapy. So if you have expressive disorder, we're working on word retrieval, we're working on circumlocution, things like that, which are skills that you need to have, hopefully, before, and also skills that you practice after you acquire a TBI or have some type of neurological damage. Um, so I kind of do a lot of like preemptive work with my kids, a lot of monitoring to make sure that things are flowing smoothly.
Okay. So my next question is, how can a concussion impact a developing brain?
A lot, yeah, a lot, their brains are very sensitive, even though humans are typically pretty resilient for some things. Brains are sensitive, developing brains are extremely sensitive. Um, and so, you can have a concussion and have mood problems afterwards, which may fly under the radar because children are naturally very moody compared to adults. So then all of a sudden we're not noticing mood swings, we're not noticing changes in behavior, we're not noticing changes in personality. And then with my population, as I mentioned earlier, excuse me, if a kid is already having communication problems and then there's like, oh, a bit of a slur to the speech, or oh, you're kind of repeating yourself, people can think, well, that's just how they are based on the profile, which is not the case. These things might be getting or exacerbated by the brain injuries. So all of my kids who do like contact sports like football or boxing or even, basketball, I talk to them about protecting themselves, protecting your body, landing a certain way. Um, I try not to have them in any compromised positions that might be more dangerous for their head. And one of my students right now is doing his senior thesis research on injury reduction in the NFL. And so a big part of that is looking at how helmets are being developed to reduce impact, right? So it's similar to how they had to change the way we build cars to reduce concussive impact on the passenger. Think about things like that with the helmets, with the padding to reduce concussive impact on the brain. Um, yeah, like you can't under you can't really afford to underemphasize how important brain health is for children. And so a big thing we also do is we do our trainings, our health trainings, and I watch videos about concussions. I try to stay up to date on concussion protocols to do, on the spot exams in case something's ever happened. Nothing has happened where I've needed to do anything like that with a child, but I try to stay ready just in case. I recommend to my coworkers that they watch certain videos about concussions. I recommend to the kids that I make the kids watch the video so that, okay, you're an athlete, you see this in your teammate, you can report it to coach. Or if something happens, you can say, Coach, I hit my head really hard and I don't feel good. So I think like awareness is key for the kids and then also for adults. Like being prepared to on the spot say, I know you typically are like this, but it seems out of character, it's out of the norm. So maybe we should stop and try to see what's going on here, see if we can make an adjustment.
All right, and then the next question I have pertains to the challenges that a young athlete might have. So my question was, what challenges would a young developing athlete with a concussion face, and how could that impact their athletic performance?
Their memory can start to fail, right? Which is really going to throw you off in terms of, oh, this is my position on the field, right? You have this concussion, no one's noticed it. Oh, 40, why are you always out of position? 40, why are you forgetting to bring your stuff to practice? 40, why are you forgetting like kind of basic stuff about what's supposed to be going on? Why do you seem out of sorts? Things like that can really sneak up on an athlete and be unnoticed because again, we think like, oh, this kid, he's always moody, or kids forget their shoes all the time. When I was a kid, I forgot X, Y, and Z. And it's like, yeah, well, this child has a brain injury. Like you need to be sitting them down, make sure he's okay. And also I think it's the culture at times of with male athletes, especially, you're gonna be tough and gritty, you're not gonna cry like a baby. And like, no, that child is injured, he should say something, he needs to sit down. You can't really tough out most injuries, especially a brain injury. You can't out tough brain damage. So things like memory, things like communication, kids are suddenly forgetting words or not stringing sentences together properly. Kids are outright, refusing to communicate. So you might think, oh, he's upset because I fussed at him or because we highlighted him being hurt. It's like, no, this child cannot communicate with you because he is injured. This child needs therapy because his brain has some damage. Um, and I think sometimes we think a lot about the plasticity of a young brain, but not a lot about how that's going to be damaged after concussive injuries and how difficult it can be to build those skills back up. Sometimes it's easier to work with older patients with TBIs or brain damage because they've had a lifelong use of certain skills. So it's easier to compensate for them versus with kids. They haven't developed all this communicative ability. So they're kind of up the creek when it comes to therapy and intervention at times. It can be a bit daunting to support a child through rehabbing after something like a brain injury.
No. Okay, then I just had a few questions left for you, Jacob.
Mhm.
So the second to last question is, how can speech language pathologists help this population of athletes?
Um, so I think it's just kind of being on the lookout for kids are into sports. A lot of communication is tied in. It's like necessary for sports. You can't really play a sport without communicating. And even if you're trying not to, you communicate with your audience, you communicate with the refs. So I was coaching a tournament this weekend, and one of our players is trying to get recruited. He wants to play college ball. Great kid, great athlete. And I told him that part of his recruitment process is his communication. So like we talk with students about body language, and I was telling him like, you mean, hey, maybe this is the thing you need to focus on your body language, how you communicate with the officials, with your teammates, with your coaches. So really it's kind of random things that you wouldn't necessarily first pull up when you thought speech and athletics. But I just encourage any speech therapist, be on the lookout for how your students communicate. Kids you work with, a lot of our kids love sports. We work with a variety of ages. A lot of our older clients love sports. So it's like be on the lookout for changes in their communication. And then also just, trying to support them in being the best communicators they can be. So you might have to talk to someone about body language or their tone or their message and like delivery. Um, like things like that will sneak into conversation. And sometimes we end up doing our job without thinking about it or without being technically on the clock, so you don't really get paid. But you can't help it at this point. You got the degree, you might as well use it, even when it's not necessarily paid work. So, but don't work for free. Don't work for wooden nickels.
All right, and then what are some of the key takeaways that you have for the audience being a speech pathologist and a sports coach?
I think key takeaways are, like I just said, staying aware. As a parent, as a speech therapist, as an educator, as a coach, we're all responsible for the health and safety of these children, just in general, because we're responsible adults. So you have to really be aware to how kids communicate. And if you know you have a child who plays a sport, then you really, I think, the kids come and talk to you about literally everything they think about, and you got to be on top of it in terms of, do you seem okay? Do you seem a little different? What sport do you play? Why are you different? I would be surprised if, I don't know, a student who likes curling was having communication issues. So maybe I'm less aware of that. But for my kids who play contact sports or do things where there are collisions, um, I try to stay aware. I try to look out for these things and then also be prepared to explain to someone else or to explain to a parent why it's important that kids work with speech therapists for maybe sports related issues. We do cognitive therapy, we do communication therapy. We assess a variety of issues. There are speech therapists who help people who have maybe vocal cord dysfunction, right? Who are runners. And it's like, well, what does that even mean? Why are they connected? Well, if your vocal folds are not functioning properly, you might have problems getting in good cyclical breaths. And the next thing you know, your runners are super gassed and having a hard time. And you would go and see a speech therapist to talk about the type of issue. So we're really all over the place. There are things like actually modification. A lot of foreign athletes come over and need help public speaking or, need help working on their English. And it's not a medical reason, but you would see a speech therapist for that. So really it's just, being open-minded to the ways that speech and sports overlap, and then also being prepared to maybe as a speech therapist or a parent, go out of your comfort zone and maybe take this kind of alternative approach to a sports problem with a speech therapist. A lot of people's, reasonably so your first instinct is going to call a sports trainer or the doctor, and they just might refer you, surprisingly, to a speech therapist. So you got to be ready for things like that, I think.
All right, thank you so much, Jacob. That was actually the last question that I had for you. I'd also like to thank the audience for listening to this Head to Speech podcast episode. I hope that this episode was informative to people who may not know much about speech pathology and or athlete brain health. I hope it has encouraged some people in possibly becoming a Head to Speech ambassador. There's always more to learn about this field. If you're interested in learning more about speech pathology and bridging the gap between brain health, you can visit www.headtospeech.org. Thank you so much. All right, bye.